They said the mountains swallowed sound, yet screams bled through the trees. A crooked cabin squatted in the valley, its chimney always black with smoke. The hollow was a wound in the mountain, a place where light dared not linger. Pines grew close and spiteful there, their branches knotted like the fingers of the damned. The road that led to the valley floor was no road at all, only a deer path trodden thin, and yet everyone in the county knew of the cabin. They knew it by the smoke that never ceased, and by the stories that crawled from it like worms from grave dirt. Children were told to keep away, though no child ever dared close enough to test the warning. Old hunters, drunk on moonshine, swore they had seen shadows flit past the broken shutters. They said the shadows were thin, bent-backed, and their teeth glinted when the firelight caught them. But no hunter followed, for the hollow was a place where even hounds refused to track. The cabin itself was a crooked thing, built of warped logs, as though the mountain rejected it from the start. Its roof sagged like the spine of a starved mule, and its windows were nailed with boards that still seemed to watch. The chimney was the truest marker of all. No matter the season, no matter the hour, smoke writhed upward in a black column, a tongue lashing at the heavens. Folks said it smelled wrong, like hair burning, like marrow cracking. The land around the cabin bore no fruit. No wildflowers, no brambleberries, not even weeds dared sprout near its steps. Only moss grew thick, damp, and velvet black, drinking from a soil soured long before. At night the air grew heavy in that place, as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting for something to pass. And sometimes it did. It was on a winter's eve, brittle and sharp, when the first scream was heard. Old Widow Collins was walking the ridge, gathering firewood, when she swore she heard it. A woman's voice, shrill and splitting, echoing through the trees. She dropped her bundle, heart seizing, and listened again. The cry came once more, softer now, but drawn out, long enough that her blood froze. When she told it in church the next Sunday, her hands still trembled. The preacher tried to calm her, to dismiss it as a fox's cry. But Widow Collins swore until her dying breath that no fox wailed like that. No fox begged for mercy between the trees, and the strangest thing, though she stood half a mile from the hollow, she swore the scream carried clear as though it rose from her own hearth. Yet the mountains were said to swallow sound. Whatever bled through that night fought against nature itself to be heard. The cabin's owners were known only in whispers. A white family, mountain stock, crueler than most. They kept slaves when no one else did, long after the Union Army passed through. Some said the mountains let them hide, others that no lawman cared enough to climb that far. Whatever the truth, iron was said to rattle beneath their floors, chains that sang whenever the wind shifted. A peddler once knocked on their door. He was never seen again. But weeks later, a boy fishing at the creek found the man's spectacles caught in the reeds, lenses cracked clean through. No one went to the cabin to ask after him. Folks in the valley had learned long ago that curiosity was a thing best buried deep. One tale told in hushed tones concerned the smoke itself. Her traveling preacher claimed he saw sparks drift up the chimney that were not sparks at all, but ashes in the shape of teeth, human teeth, falling like snow before vanishing into the sky. He swore his mule bolted in terror, nearly breaking his neck on the rocky trail. When he told it in town, no one laughed. They only spat, muttered, and warned him to never ride that way again. Still, the chimney burned. Still, the cabin squatted, hunchbacked and waiting. There were nights when the trees thrashed, though no wind stirred them. Nights when the smoke bent low across the ground, crawling like a serpent instead of climbing to heaven. Travelers whispered that if you walked too near, the fog would cling to your skin and whisper things in a tongue older than English, older than Cherokee, older than the mountains themselves. Some claimed the family was no longer human, that hunger had twisted them, that they had taken to feasting on things the body should never crave. Others swore the slaves who once rattled the chains beneath the floor had cursed them, that every mouthful of meat they swallowed was ash in their souls. The truth, whatever it was, never left the hollow. One spring night, a farmhand named Caleb wandered too close while chasing a stray heifer. He swore afterward that he saw candlelight flicker through the boarded windows. For an instant, just one, he glimpsed a face pressed to the wood, staring out. It was pale, gaunt, with eyes sunk so deep they seemed to be pits. But worse than the face was the mouth. It smiled, wide, too wide, showing teeth filed sharp like a dog's. Caleb ran. He left the heifer behind, never returned for it. And in the morning the calf's bones were found at the creek, picked clean, the skull split in half as if by human hands. Still the cabin stood. Still the smoke rose, and on certain nights when the wind howled just right, the screams returned. Not one voice, but many. Some high, some low, some ragged and choked, as though the hollow itself were full of throats, all crying at once, swallowed but never silenced. They said the mountains swallowed sound. But in the hollow the screams always bled through. Beneath the floorboards the iron still rattled. Those who listened closely swore they could hear prayers curdle into curses. The cellar beneath the cabin was not built for storing root vegetables or salted pork. It was dug deeper, too deep, a wound carved into the mountain's flank. The soil there was black and damp, heavy with a smell that clung to skin like rot. No lamp burned in that space, for lamps guttered out the moment they were lit, as if some breath unseen smothered the flame. The only light that ever touched those depths was what fell through the gaps between floorboards. Thin, trembling blades of sunlight sharp as needles, never enough to chase the shadows. The shadows there seemed to live, to writhe, as though they had patience longer than any man. And in those shadows, iron. The chains were said to run the length of the cellar, bolted into the stone itself. They were old, older than the cabin, some whispered, as though the family had dragged them here from elsewhere, carried their cruelty with them like an inheritance. The iron was rusted but strong, blackened with sweat and salt, heavy as a grave. Shackles still clung to them, rings twisted and bent where wrists and ankles had once fought for freedom. On quiet nights those chains moved. Not much, never more than a shiver, never more than a drag across the stone floor, but enough. Enough that anyone who dared lean close could swear something was still bound there, something that breathed slow and shallow, waiting. There was an old tale of a girl named Mercy Lee who worked as a maid in one of the valley houses. She claimed in whispers to her sisters that she had once followed her master to the cabin, carrying a sack of flour on her back. When he went inside, she lingered near the steps, too frightened to enter. And it was then, with her ear close to the door, that she heard it, voices murmuring from beneath the boards, not one voice, many. Men and women both, speaking in tones too low for words to carry clear. But Mercy swore until her dying bed, that they were not praying. Not any more. They was calling on things, she whispered to her sisters, things that lived down deeper than the roots of these mountains. They said names I never heard before, names that made my teeth ache. When she tried to repeat one of those names, her tongue faltered, twisted against her teeth, as though the sound itself did not belong in the human mouth. Her sisters begged her never to speak of it again. She didn't, but her hair turned white before her 25th year. Miners, too, told their own stories. Men who tunneled the ridges nearby claimed their picks once struck something hollow. Not stone, not wood, something that rang like iron. They left their tools where they fell and never returned. When asked why, they shook their heads and spat into the dirt, muttering, "You don't dig where chains already lie." It was said the family who lived in that cabin above the cellar grew rich, not in coin, but in something darker. Their cattle never starved, though no pasture grew in the hollow. Their corn, twisted and black though it looked, never failed to fill their bellies. They did not sicken in winters when neighbors coughed blood into rags, and yet their prosperity reeked. For every full belly in that cabin, there was a sound from beneath, a cry muffled by soil, a curse spoken in tongues long forgotten. Some believed the family fed the cellar, that the smoke that curled from their chimney was the smoke of offerings, flesh turned to ash, carried down to whatever listened from the dark. And the chains rattled in answer, as if pleased. A story was told of a farmhand, brave or foolish, who crept close to the cabin one night, meaning to peer beneath its foundation. His friends dared him with whiskey, and his pride forced his hand. He lay flat on his belly, pressing his face to the cracks between the logs at the cabin's base. He saw nothing at first, only dark. But then movement, slow dragging movement, the shine of iron, and then an eye not bright, not human but pale and lidless, rolling upward from the shadows, fixing on his own with a hunger he could not name. The boy screamed and scrambled back, tearing his palms on the rocks. He made it down the mountain, white with terror, his words tangled beyond sense. He could not say what he had seen. But 2 weeks later, when fever took him, his last words were clear enough. "It's still down there. Still waiting. The cellar remained locked, door chained and barred from above. But even locks rot, even bars yield. On damp nights, when the fog grew thick and pressed its fingers through the trees, locals swore they heard the cabin floor groan. They swore they heard a sound like iron being dragged, slow, patient, deliberate, as though something tested its bonds. No one dared approach then, not even the bravest hunters, not even the drunkest fools. For the chains were not just chains, they were promises. And promises once broken do not mend. There are still men who swear in hushed tones that the prayers of those chained in the cellar never reached heaven, that they curdled on their tongues and sank into the earth instead, growing into something else, something that lived in the hollow still, something that had learned to love the sound of iron, and beneath the cabin floor the rattling never stopped. The White family dined well, though the bones in their midden told another story. Every rib, every femur was gnawed thin as though the forest itself was starving. The hearth fire in the cabin never slept. Day or night, its glow bled through the cracks in the shutters, a sickly orange that seemed to devour the dark rather than warm it. Smoke crawled from the chimney in a constant column. Not the grey of oak or hickory, but darker, greasier, black, as though the flames licked something that resisted burning. The family gathered around their table each night, wood scarred with knife cuts, its corners charred from candle drips. Their plates were never empty, though no one in the valley ever saw them hunt. When neighbors asked what filled their larder, the patriarch only grinned, showing teeth yellowed by tobacco and meat. He would not answer, but his children, thin, hollow-eyed, always watching, would let slip small things. "We never go hungry," they'd murmur, as if repeating some sacred vow, and indeed their bellies never seemed to shrink, though fields nearby starved. Behind the cabin, where most folk would keep a chicken coop or woodpile, there rose instead a midden heap, a place where refuse was flung. At first glance, it was no different from any farm's trash pile. But a closer look turned the stomach. The heap was bone. Not just the bones of cattle or pigs, though those too were mixed in abundance, split and cracked for marrow. There were stranger shapes, finger bones delicate and thin, jawbones human in form, a skull once weathered by rain, jaw pried wide as though in a final scream. Locals who stumbled on the heap swore they saw every bone gnawed thin, as though teeth had rasped them down until nothing remained but splinters. Too many bones for any family, no matter how large, to account for. Too many for game alone, and the smell, oh the smell. Not the sour tang of decay, not the rankness of old meat. But something else. Something sweet, cloying like pork roasted too long, like fat dripping onto coals and hissing until the air itself grew greasy. It clung to the throat, made men gag and women faint. Yet the family smiled, full-bellied, their chimney ever bleeding black. There was a story of a tinker who lodged with them one night. He had been travelling through the hills, cart laden with pots, when he found himself lost by dusk. The cabin offered him shelter, warmth, and a place at their table. He ate heartily, praising the tenderness of the stew, though he could not name the meat. They gave him cup after cup of whiskey until his tongue grew loose. At last his head nodded, and the family laughed soft as shadows. He never left the hollow. Weeks later, boys fishing at the creek found his cart half buried in mud, pots strewn like bones. And months after that, a trapper claimed he saw the man's boots sticking from the midden heap, heels chewed down to nubs. The trapper told no one until he was dying. Some truths were too black to speak aloud, while breath still filled the chest. But the stranger's tale was not of bones or boots or gnawed skulls. It was of what the family did with the ashes, for when their feasting was done, whatever that feasting was, they did not bury the remnants. They burned them, not in the hearth where meals were cooked, but in a great pit behind the cabin. Night after night fire blazed there, and into it went not just bones, but hair, teeth, even the wood of coffins pried from graves. All turned to cinders, and those ashes they did not scatter. They saved them. Neighbors whispered of clay jars sealed with wax, lined in neat rows along the cellar wall. Within each a grey powder, fine and bitter-smelling. Sometimes on stormy nights, the family carried those jars outside. They would break the seals and fling handfuls of ash into the wind, chanting in low tones. The smoke seemed to thicken when they did, curling like a veil around the cabin, as though something in it hungered for the taste. Others swore they saw the children scoop ashes into their stew, stirring it like salt. Their lips grey when they smiled. The midden grew higher year by year until crows refused to circle above it. Dogs howled if brought near. And yet no sheriff, no preacher, no neighbour dared question. The hollow was a place apart, a place where the rules of man bent to something older. All they knew for certain was this: the family dined well, always well, and the bones in their midden told another story. When rains came hard, the creek swelled. Once it overflowed, washing part of the midden heap downstream. Children found ribs snagged on the rocks. Women saw femurs lodged between roots, and old men who had lived through wars swore the bones were not all beast. They recognized the curve of a collarbone, the length of a shin. The family said nothing. Their chimney smoked on, and so it was accepted in silence that the hollow fed itself. Fed and feasted and turned its feasts to ash. Every rib, every femur, every bone was gnawed thin, as though the forest itself was starving. Thunder split the sky, but it was no storm that came down from the ridge. By morning, the master's hounds howled at nothing, their throats torn open. The mountains had always carried storms. Black thunderclouds gathered fast in those ridges, spilling rain that could drown fields and wash roads into rivers of mud. But the night the chains broke, the storm was different. The first sign was the silence. Evening came heavy and damp, yet no whippoorwill called. No owl hooted. The crickets, the cicadas, all the thousand small voices of the forest choked into stillness. The hollow felt like a held breath, long and strangled, as if the very earth waited for some unholy birth. The family in the cabin sat to their supper, bowls steaming, fire snapping. But the smoke that night crawled low along the floorboards instead of rising. Coiling around their ankles, clinging like damp fingers, the patriarch cursed, thinking the chimney clogged, but the fire only flared brighter, as though fed by some hidden bellows. The shadows in the corners stretched long, too long, their shapes not matching the bodies that cast them. And then the first sound came, not thunder, not wind, the rattle of iron. It rose from beneath the floor like the slow toll of a church bell, deep and hollow, the chains in the cellar dragging across stone. At first it was only one chain, then another, until it was a chorus, a clamour of metal striking metal, pulling, twisting. Wrenching free, the family froze, spoons halfway to lips. Then came the voices. They did not rise as cries of prayer. They rose as curses, low, guttural, thick with hate that had fermented long in the dark. They spoke in tongues forgotten, words salted with grief and sharpened by vengeance. The very beams of the cabin seemed to shake, as if each syllable gnawed at the wood. The children covered their ears, but it was no use. The sound was not heard with the ears. It rang in the teeth, in the bones, the mother whispered, trembling. It's only the wind, only the wind. But the wind was still, and the storm was not yet upon them. When the first chain snapped, it was louder than any thunder. A crack that split the night, carrying through the valley so fierce that men in cabins miles away woke from their sleep. They swore afterward the sound shook their windows, rattled their walls. Then another chain broke, then another. The ground quivered beneath the cabin, earth shuddering as though something buried deep was clawing upward. The table shook, bowls spilling, stew bleeding across the boards like blood. The patriarch roared for his sons, for his rifle, for the dogs. But the dogs were already howling, chained in the yard, their cries thin and ragged, filled with a terror beasts know before men. And then, silence again. Not stillness. Not quiet, the silence of something listening. It was the second snap that loosed the storm. Lightning split the sky, but not from above. It came from the ground, from the very hollow itself, arcing upward, searing trees black, setting brush aflame. The rain that followed was not rain, but ash, drifting down in grey flakes that clung to hair and skin, stinging like sparks. The hounds broke their chains, fleeing into the woods, but none made it far. Their howls turned to whimpers, then to gurgles, until the night was split with the sound of throats tearing open. By morning their carcasses lay strewn, eyes wide, jaws slack, as though something had hushed them mid-breath. The family barred the doors. They dragged chairs against them, prayed in stammers to a God that did not answer the hollow. The children wept. The mother clutched her crucifix until her palms bled, but the cellar door beneath them groaned, slowly, patiently. Wood splintered, nails tore free. The chains were not broken by hands alone. They were broken by hate, the kind that festers in darkness, the kind fed with every lash, every hunger, every prayer denied, and once that hate was loosed, there was no binding it again. A neighbor on the ridge swore he saw it from afar. He was tending his still when the storm broke, and in the black between lightning flashes, he glimpsed the cabin below. He swore the roof lifted, timbers bending, as though something vast pressed up from beneath. Smoke poured from the chimney, not black but red, glowing like blood. He ran. He did not stop until he reached the river, half a day's ride. He never set foot near the hollow again. By dawn the cabin still stood, though crooked now, slanted as if weary of standing. Its shutters hung loose. Its chimney sagged, but no voices came from within, only the echo of chains rattling still, faint and endless, like a sound carried by the bones of the earth. And when hunters dared approach later that week, they found the hounds dead. The cabin door split down its middle, and inside, silence, no family, no bodies. Only bowls overturned, their contents hardened to crust, and the cellar door gaping wide. By morning, the master's hounds howled at nothing. Their throats torn open, and the hollow was never silent again. They fled into the hills, but their bellies cried out for more than corn or rabbit. A new appetite stalked their veins, darker than famine, older than man. The night the chains broke, the family vanished from their cabin without a trace. At first light, their neighbors came cautiously down the ridge, rifles in hand, expecting to find slaughter or ash. Instead, they found emptiness. Bowls overturned, chairs splintered, doors hanging from their hinges. The hearth was cold for the first time in living memory. Its stones blackened with something thicker than soot, but there were signs, small and sickening, that the family had not died. A trail of footprints led from the cellar, barefoot and uneven, as though those who made them staggered rather than walked. They wandered into the forest beyond the clearing, weaving and swaying like drunkards, or newborn things still learning how to use their limbs. Blood marked the earth where their steps fell. Not much, just droplets, but enough to stain the moss. The townsfolk did not follow. They turned back before the tree line. Some whispered prayers, some spat on the ground. None wished to know what had gone into those woods, but they would learn soon enough. Days passed. Then a week. And then the killings began. It started with livestock. A mule found gutted by the creek, hide peeled back as though by careful hands. A herd of goats slaughtered in their pen, each with its skull cracked clean and the brains scooped out. Chickens vanished entirely, feathers strewn like autumn leaves, heads gnawed to splinters. No tracks were left. No beast in those hills hunted with such precision. And yet the killings grew bolder. One night a trapper vanished from his lean-to. His rifle lay beside the fire, unfired. In the morning his camp was strewn with the remains of his supper, and the bones of his hand stripped to the knuckle. Then came the preacher's daughter, walking home from evening prayers. Her bonnet was found the next day snagged on a blackberry bush, soaked through with blood. The sheriff's men found nothing else. Not a scrap of cloth, not a drop of flesh, only the same barefoot tracks in the mud, circling the path again and again as though whoever left them could not decide whether to go forward or turn back. They fled into the hills, yes. But the hunger followed. It was not the hunger of bellies empty from famine. It was deeper than that, older. A hollow gnawing that began in the stomach and spread outward, crawling beneath the skin, curling behind the eyes. It was a craving that no bread could fill, no stew could quiet. Corn turned to ash on their tongues, rabbit rotted in their throats, and still they hungered. The father was the first to give in. Some say he fell upon a dying deer, tearing at its flesh with his teeth until nothing remained but hooves and bone. Others say it was not a deer at all, but a hunter. He ambushed on the trail, his skull shattered by a rock, his liver torn free before he could scream. The mother followed, her hands trembling as she dug up a grave in the old churchyard, pressing handfuls of damp flesh to her lips. Her eyes rolled back, tears streaking her cheeks, not in sorrow but in ecstasy. The children were the worst. They had been born into cruelty, nursed on blood and fear, and the hunger fit them like a second skin. They learned to hunt together, moving silent as shadows, stalking travelers on the mountain road. One boy was found hanging from a tree branch, throat bitten through, his skin gnawed as though by wolves. But the sheriff swore there were no paw prints, only small bare feet dancing in circles around the tree. The old folks in the valley said they were cursed. Others whispered they were transformed, no longer human at all. Perhaps the cellar's darkness had seeped into their blood. Perhaps the hatred and suffering that once moaned through those chains had taken root in their flesh. Whatever the truth, the family was gone. What remained was something else, something that slunk through the forest with human eyes and animal hunger. There was a farmer named Ellis Crane who claimed he glimpsed them one twilight as he walked home from town. They crouched by the creek, 4 shapes hunched over a deer carcass, their backs bare, their spines knotted like roots. They tore strips of meat with their teeth, snarling when one tried to take too much. Ellis dropped his lantern and ran. But he swore until his dying day that one of them, one of those crouched things, had turned its head and called his name. The voice was a woman's, familiar. It was the voice of the mother. By midsummer, the hills themselves seemed sick. Game vanished. Travelers took detours miles out of their way. And at night, the forest echoed with strange sounds, not the howls of wolves nor the cries of owls, but something else. Low guttural, hungry sounds. The breaking of bone. The wet suck of marrow. The sheriff sent a posse once, 6 men with rifles and dogs. None returned. The dogs came back days later, tails tucked, bellies distended as though they had fed on something they were never meant to taste. The valley learned to stop asking questions. No one spoke the family's name anymore. No one spoke of the cabin. It was said the hunger had swallowed it too, dragging it down into the soil. Yet when the wind shifted just right, the people swore they could smell it still. That same greasy smoke curling from a chimney that no longer stood, and they knew then that the hunger still roamed. It stalked their hills, it breathed their air, and it would never be sated. A new appetite stalked their veins, darker than famine, older than man. The forest took their voices but not their tongues, and in the stillest nights the hills themselves seemed to hum with the sound of their hunger. At first the people thought the killings were all there was to fear. Livestock torn apart, travelers vanished, bones scattered like dice in the leaves. These were horrors enough. But then came the songs. They began low, faint, like the muttering of a brook beneath stones. A sound at the edge of hearing, too far away to name, yet close enough to raise the hair on the back of the neck. At times it seemed like a woman's lullaby, sweet, almost gentle. At others it was the droning hum of many throats at once, carrying a rhythm older than prayer. The shepherd boys swore they heard it first, while tending their flocks on the ridge. The sheep pricked their ears, froze as one, and bolted downhill as though fleeing a fire. The boys followed, trembling, and told their mothers they had heard a hymn not made by men. The elders listened, shook their heads, and said nothing. They had heard the same sound years ago, in the time of chains and blood. When the cellar beneath the cabin still rang with iron, the songs grew bolder as summer deepened. Hunters camping in the pines would wake to the sound of voices in the dark. They could not say how many, only that the voices moved, slipping from tree to tree, circling the camp, weaving words no man knew. The language was jagged, harsh, yet carried the shape of music, like hymns sung backward through broken teeth. One hunter swore he woke to find his brother standing in the firelight, eyes closed, mouth slack, humming the tune he had heard in his sleep. He tried to shake him, but the man did not stir. Only when the humming stopped did he collapse to the ground, lips blue, lungs rasping as though he had nearly drowned. Some said the songs were meant to lure, like a siren's call. Others swore they were curses, words carved in sound, binding the hills themselves to rot and hunger. The preacher in town tried to quiet the people, telling them the devil was at work, and that no song, however foul, could harm a man who carried the Lord's name on his lips. But a week later the preacher himself went missing. His Bible was found in the mud, pages soaked as though it had been wept upon. From the tree line the sheriff's men heard singing, low, sweet, steady like a hymn. But the voice was his. One family, desperate for answers, went up the ridge to seek the cabin itself, though no one had dared tread that path in years. They carried lanterns and knives, their children clutching their skirts. At the clearing, they found only the chimney standing, half swallowed by vines, and yet from beneath the stones, the songs rose. They said the voices sounded as if they were coming from under the earth itself, as though the cellar had never been abandoned. The family fled, lanterns swinging wildly, the songs following them step for step, growing louder with every heartbeat, until at last they reached the valley. Only then did the sound cease, as though cut clean by a blade. When they turned, the clearing was empty, silent, and the chimney stood in shadow. But their youngest daughter, a girl of 6, clung to her mother's arm and whispered, "They asked me to come back. They said I already know the words." What terrified the valley most was not that the family sang, but that others soon joined them. Men would vanish into the woods and return days later. Hollow-eyed, their mouths cracked with blood. They spoke little, ate nothing, but at night their voices rose, not in screams, not in prayer, but in song. They hummed the same tune as the hills. Their wives would slap them, plead with them, drag them to the church steps, but it was no use. One by one they slipped away. Some were found hanging from the rafters of their barns, their tongues missing. Others were never seen again. The valley understood. The songs were not merely echoes. They were invitations. By autumn, no man dared cross the ridge. Travelers vanished before they reached the valley, their wagons overturned, their horses left to rot. At night, the wind carried the voices across the fields. Farmers swore they heard their own names sung from the forest. Wives heard the voices of dead children. And one night, an entire chorus rose, 100 voices at least, all weeping the same mournful melody, until the stars seemed to dim. The bravest man in town tried to follow the sound, musket in hand. His wife begged him not to. He never returned. But 3 nights later, the people woke to hear his voice among the chorus. There are songs men are not meant to hear, songs older than prayer, older than hunger, older even than chains, and yet the hills remember them still. They say if you walk the ridge at dusk, you must cover your ears with wax and hum your own name over and over again, lest the voices slip inside you. For if they do, you will hum along without knowing, your tongue shaping syllables your mind cannot understand, and when at last you falter, when your breath runs dry, the voices will not stop. They will only grow louder, until you join them beneath the earth. The forest took their voices, but not their tongues, and the hills will sing them forever. The dead should rest, but in Black Hollow the ground had grown restless, and the hunger no longer cared for the difference between warm flesh and cold bone. It began with the graveyard. In the valley's old churchyard, where crooked stones leaned like tired men, the earth shifted. Not all at once, not in a quake or a storm, but in small ways, subtle and dreadful. Graves that had been filled sank deeper, as though something below pulled at them. Coffins groaned. Soil cracked as if something beneath had exhaled. The gravedigger, a man older than most, was the first to notice. He went out one morning, spade in hand, to tend to a burial. The coffin had been laid down only the day before, but now the earth was sunken, as if 50 years had passed, and the box had rotted hollow. He pressed his ear to the ground. From below, he heard gnawing. By midsummer, the graves no longer held. Coffin lids were splintered, wood chewed like kindling, bones dragged free. Some graves lay open, clawed from within, others torn apart by hands too strong, too many, to be explained by scavenger beasts. And yet the worst was not the desecration, it was the return. One widow swore she saw her husband walking at twilight, his burial shroud stained black, his jaw hanging open as though gnawed upon. He did not speak, did not moan, did not plead for rest. He only leaned close, his teeth snapping inches from her cheek, before shambling into the woods where the hollow lay. Others saw the same. Mothers saw their dead sons. Children saw their buried fathers. The churchyard emptied one by one, until the only things left in the graves were scraps of linen and nails where coffins had been. No door was safe. Families began bolting shutters at night, nailing wood across their windows, piling salt along thresholds. But hunger does not care for wood or salt or prayer. One farmer woke to the sound of chewing in his barn. He took up his lantern, stepped inside, and dropped it at once. For there, crouched in the hay, was his daughter, his dead daughter, the one they had buried last winter when the fever took her. She turned, face pale, lips torn to ribbons, and her hands dripping with blood. Before her lay the family cow, its belly ripped open, ribs pried apart like a butcher's carcass. She was eating, not like a child, not like a beast, but like something that had never forgotten hunger, even beneath the soil. The valley whispered, "It is not just the family now." The hunger has spread. Some said the first cannibals had carried their curse into the earth itself, feeding their sickness into roots and stone until even the dead drank of it. Others said the songs had raised them, the chants stirring not only the living but the lifeless as well. Calling them to feast, whatever the truth, the result was clear. The dead no longer belonged to the ground. Travelers spoke of figures on the road at night. Not quick, not loud, but shambling, dragging. Their eyes were glassy, their lips split, their bones jutting through skin that had been chewed from within. They carried no will but hunger, no memory but the grave, and worse, sometimes they came in groups. Entire families of the dead, walking hand in hand, their mouths slick, their voices humming the same broken hymns the living had begun to sing. The hills echoed with a chorus that was not made by throats alone, but by the clattering of teeth. The sheriff's men tried to fight them. Muskets cracked across the valley, iron shot tearing through bone, and the bodies fell, but they did not stay fallen. They rose again, slower perhaps, but steady, gnawing the air as they moved. One man swore he shot his own brother 3 times through the heart, watched him collapse, and yet, when he turned his back, he heard footsteps again. When he spun around, his brother was gone, dragged back into the fog as though by unseen hands. The church held its final service that autumn. Candles burned low, hymns were sung hoarsely, and prayers rattled from lips that no longer had faith in them. For even as the bell tolled, something scraped at the church door. They ignored it. They tried to pray louder, but the wood creaked. Nails groaned, and then from beneath the floorboards the singing began. Low at first, then louder, until the congregation heard it clearly, the voices of their dead humming beneath their feet. A song stitched from hunger, from earth, from endless gnawing. The preacher dropped his Bible, the women shrieked. And still the song grew. The valley fled after that. Whole families vanished overnight, leaving hearths cold, doors unlatched, fields unharvested. Yet those who fled found no safety. They said the dead followed them across rivers, through forests, down into towns where no tale of Black Hollow had ever been told, because hunger does not care for borders. The old say, it still goes on, that no corpse lies untouched in those hills, no coffin remains sealed. The hollow feeds itself. They whisper that the family began it, but it was the earth that finished it, taking into itself the taste of flesh, the memory of teeth on bone. And now it is not merely men who eat, it is the ground the dead should rest. But in Black Hollow no one rests, not the living, not the buried, not the soil itself. And in the night, when the fog comes down and the hills begin to hum, the chewing begins again. The fog came down like a shroud. It rolled from the hollow in slow coils thick as wool, swallowing trees, fields, and roads alike, until the world beyond one's lantern no longer existed. It was not ordinary mist. The valley had seen fog before, gentle veils that clung to the river, thin breaths that lifted with the sun. This was heavier, hungrier. It crept into the lungs and settled in the chest until every breath was shallow, strained as if the fog itself drank the air before man could. At first, the people thought it a curse of weather. But weather does not whisper, weather does not follow footsteps, and weather does not open eyes. Travelers vanished in it. One merchant, bound for the next town, was found 3 days later, his wagon overturned and his horse torn to ribbons. His lantern still burned, dangling from the wheel. But there was no body. Only footprints circling in the mud, round and round, as though he had walked in place until his feet bled. Others went missing without a trace. Their lanterns were found first, always lit, always swaying as though still held by unseen hands. Then their packs, their boots, their hats, but never their flesh. They said the fog kept it. The first to speak of the eyes was a boy. He swore that while walking the ridge with his father, the fog swallowed them whole. He clutched the man's hand, trembling, when suddenly he saw shapes, pale globes floating in the mist, eyes, dozens of them, some too high for any man, some too low, crawling along the ground. They did not blink. They only stared. His father told him not to speak of it. But the boy woke that night screaming, nails clawing at his face, shrieking, "They're still looking at me!" By dawn he was gone. His window stood open, fog curling inside like a hand. The valley whispered of the fog as if it were alive. They said it moved with intent, curling down one road but not another, folding into barns, slipping through the cracks of doors. It muffled sound, swallowed footsteps, smothered cries. Even dogs would not bark within it. They whined, tails between their legs, teeth bared at nothing, Some said it carried voices, not the voices of the living but of the lost, fathers calling to sons, mothers crooning to babes. And if you followed those voices, you did not return. Others swore they saw shapes within, tall figures dragging chains, crawling forms with too many limbs, shadows stitched together by hunger. But always, always, there were the eyes. A woman named Mercy told of her brother. He vanished in the fog while cutting wood, but she swore she saw him return that same night, standing outside her window. His face was pale, his smile wide, his eyes wrong. Like lanterns, she said. They're like lanterns burning from the inside. When she called his name, he did not answer. When she prayed, he only tilted his head, his teeth gnashing softly, until the fog thickened and he was gone. They buried an empty coffin for him a week later. The sheriff's men tried to fight it, but how can a musket strike mist? They rode into the hollow with torches, shouting bravely, only for their flames to gutter, their cries to vanish, and their horses to return alone. On the saddles were scratches, not claw marks, not teeth, but grooves like fingernails, gouged deep into the leather. Some claimed the fog was the family's doing, that the cannibals had fed so deeply on the valley's flesh that the land itself had joined their feast. Others swore it was the dead, chewing their way out of the soil, their breath rising as mist. But a few, the oldest few, remembered a darker tale. They said the fog had always been there, waiting in the hollow. A hunger older than the cabin, older than chains, older even than the first settler's axe. And the family had merely awakened it, given it form, given it eyes. One night a farmer tried to drive through it. His wife and children clung to him as the wagon rattled down the road. Lanterns hung from the sides, horses whipped hard, wheels cracking through the mud. Hours passed. The road stretched on. The fog never thinned. At last his wife whispered, "We are not moving." For though the wheels turned, though the horses strained, the forest never changed. The same crooked pine, the same hollow stump, the same stone rose again and again in the lantern's glow. They had circled into the fog's throat, trapped in its belly. The farmer leapt down to run, to seek some landmark. He vanished before their eyes swallowed whole. The wagon was found a week later, horses skeletonized, lanterns still burning. No family, but in the mud beside the wheels, dozens of footprints pressed close together, leading nowhere. They say the fog still rises, especially in autumn when the air grows wet and the hills bleed silence. Travelers whisper of lanterns swaying in the mist, of faces staring without lids, of eyes hovering too near, too many, too human. And if you look too long, they say, you will see your own eyes staring back at you, hung in the fog like twin moons, waiting to be claimed. The fog came down like a shroud, and inside it, the hunger found new ways to watch. The land soured, though no storm had touched it. The hollow wept rot, and the valley began to starve. At first the change was subtle. Corn stalks grew brittle, their leaves spotted black, the ears within withered and hollow. Wheat bent too early, its grains soft and mold-thick before harvest. Potatoes came up blistered, oozing foul juices that stank of something closer to flesh than soil. Farmers blamed rain, blight, the turning of seasons. But the rains had been steady, the sun had shone. The land had no reason to fail, except for hunger. The hunger had spread beneath their feet. Livestock followed. Cows birthed calves without eyes, their bleating thin and broken, as though choked by invisible hands. Piglets were born with teeth too sharp, gnashing even at the teat. Chickens hatched with wings torn, their bones jutting like twigs, and those that lived grew restless. Horses would not step near the hollow. Oxen dropped dead in their yokes when driven past the ridge. The animals seemed to sense what the people refused to admit, that the land itself had turned against them. The first child to die was a girl of 9. She ate from her mother's garden, a handful of beans, no more. But within the hour her belly swelled, her eyes rolled back, and she vomited black earth until her body stilled. The family burned the garden that night, flames curling into the fog. But even as the ash rose, something stirred in the soil. Roots twitched. Worms writhed. And in the smoke they swore they saw faces, hungry faces, gnashing teeth. The curse did not end with crops or cattle. The valley itself began to turn. Wells filled with dark water, the taste of iron heavy on the tongue. Fields that had once grown golden and sweet lay barren, their dirt clotted with bones that no one had buried. And the forest grew strange. Oaks bent as if leaning to listen. Pines bled sap black as tar. Mushrooms sprouted in shapes that looked like ears, like hands, like tongues reaching. Those who walked the woods claimed the trees whispered their names. Some said the ground pulsed beneath their feet, soft as if they were treading not on soil but on flesh. The valley turned inward, clinging to what little could be gathered. Mothers ground bark to make bread. Fathers hunted rats. Children gnawed leather for the taste of anything. Yet hunger does not leave a place empty. It fills it with itself. Those who starved began to dream. They saw the hollow in their sleep, saw the cabin chimney coughing black smoke. They woke with their mouths wet, teeth aching, stomachs growling not for bread or meat but for bone. One man confessed to his wife that he dreamed of their infant son roasted in the hearth. She wept, called him cursed, and fled to her sister's house. But 3 nights later the child was gone. His cradle was empty, his blanket stiff with blood, and his father's lips slick with grease. The valley stopped speaking of hunger after that. They called it the Hollow's Feast. Some claimed the land itself demanded tithes, that every field, every garden, every living thing was bound to the cabin's hunger now, that the chimney would never stop smoking until it had taken every soul, and still it would demand more. The preacher tried once more to stand against it. He gathered the people in the bare church, his voice trembling but fierce. "The land cannot curse you," he shouted, "unless you give yourselves to it." And yet, even as he spoke, blood bubbled from the cracks in the floorboards. It crept across the church's stones, pooling at the pulpit. The preacher froze. His Bible slipped from his hands into the red. By the time the people fled, the church's bell tolled on its own, ringing long into the night, though no rope pulled it. No crop was safe. No child was safe. The land ate. It drank their prayers, their labor, their hope. It gave back nothing but rot. And still the cabin chimney smoked. Some said it was no longer wood that burned there, but marrow, fat, and breath itself, even from the ridge. Men swore they saw sparks rise, sparks that looked like eyes floating up into the night sky, only to fall again with the fog. By winter the valley was hollowed out. Families vanished, fields lay black, and only the strongest clung on. Yet no matter how far they fled, they carried the hollow with them. Their fields in other towns spoiled, their cattle birthed wrong, their wells soured. The curse did not bind itself to land alone. Hurt bound itself to blood, and the families who remained would carry it forever. The land soured, and those who ate from it soured too, until hunger was not just in the belly but in the marrow, in the air, in the very sound of the hills. The curse of Black Hollow was not famine. It was a feast without end. They say the family never died, and on certain nights when the fog clings thick and the chimney smokes red, you can still hear the sound of chewing. The hollow has no seasons. Winter may crust the ridges with snow, spring may green the fields below, but in the valley of the cabin, the air is always the same, damp, sour, heavy with the perfume of rot. It is a place where time has no grip. Grass grows too quickly, then blackens. Trees lean too far and never fall. And the cabin, though every board should have rotted, every stone collapsed, still squats in the clearing. Its roof sags, its windows gape, but its hearth is never cold. Smoke bleeds from the chimney even when no wood lies split, curling up as though fed by lungs rather than flame. Some claim they've seen shadows moving behind its warped glass, bent shapes jerking, gnawing, heads thrown back in laughter, or was it weeping? Their teeth catching the dim firelight as they chewed. The few who dared creep close enough to the cabin all told the same tale. The door hangs ajar, but no wind stirs it. Step inside and the hearth glows low, embers pulsing like a heart. Round the table lie plates, bones piled high upon them, gnawed clean but wet as if fresh. Cups sit overturned, their rims cracked with dried blood. But it is not the table that freezes the breath in the chest. It is the walls, for there, carved deep into the timbers, are grooves, rows upon rows of bite marks, some wide as a man's jaw, some small as a child's. The very wood has been eaten, chewed down to splinters, as though even the cabin itself was not safe from their hunger. And if you linger long enough, you will hear it, the sound of lips smacking, of bones cracking, of marrow sucked. Not echo, not memory, but something happening in the room, though your eyes see nothing. That is when most run, but some do not. The legends say those who sit at the table too long find themselves unable to rise. Their legs root to the chair, their hands tremble, their mouths water. Hunger blooms in their bellies, sharp, vicious, unbearable, and then the feast begins. No platters appear, no servants lay food. The hunger itself becomes the meal. Their teeth sink into what is not there. Their mouths move, their jaws ache. They chew until their lips split, until their throats run red. They chew though nothing rests between their teeth. Chew until they feel the crunch of phantom bone, the gush of phantom blood. By the time dawn comes, there is no one left at the table. Only the chair, damp and dark, the floorboards sticky with what was lost. But the worst tales are of those who escape. They leave the cabin screaming, clothes torn, mouths foaming. They flee the hollow, staggering through fog, through forest, back to their homes. For a time they believe themselves free. Then the hunger returns. It starts small, a taste for undercooked meat, a craving for marrow soup. Then it grows. Bread turns to ash in their mouths, wine curdles, water tastes of rot. Only flesh satisfies, and even then only briefly. Their families notice first. The way they stare too long at their children. The way their teeth grind in sleep. The way their lips move, humming those cursed songs, as if keeping time with some banquet still ongoing in the hollow, and always. It ends the same way, with screams in the night, blood in the bedclothes, and a chimney smoking red. Though no fire was ever lit, the valley lies empty now. Fields gone wild, houses crumbling, churches collapsed. But the hollow remains. Travelers, strangers, fools, they all tell of the same thing when they stumble too near. A glow in the distance, faint, flickering, the smell of roast meat, sweet and cloying, and a sound carried on the wind, chewing, laughing, gnashing, feasting. Some claim it is only echoes, memories imprinted on the land. Others swear the family sits still at their table, never aging, never dying, their feast eternal. That their hunger has become their body, their curse, their immortality, and some say they are waiting for the table to fill again. Even now there are rules whispered about the hollow, rules meant to keep the living from joining the banquet. Do not follow the smell of cooking. Do not light a lantern when the fog is red. Do not answer when you hear your name sung from the trees. And above all, never sit at the table, for once you sit you will never rise again. They say the family never died. And on certain nights when the wind shifts and the fog creeps down, the windows glow red and you hear chewing. Not behind you, not before you, but all around. The banquet never ends.